Hi there, and welcome to the Jig-Master workshop. In this episode, we are going to put together a circle cutting jig for our neglected bandsaw. It's a useful, effective jig. It's also simple to assemble. Let's get started by pulling the necessary components off the rack. Well, that's the last of the components we need. Let's grab some hardware from the bins and head over to the bench. Well, here we are at the bench. Let's review all the parts and components that we need for this jig. Here we have our base unit, which we'll be using as our sled, a T-track, which we'll be using for our miter bar, a support beam for our pivot pin, two stabilizing components, a handle, a threaded knob, machine screws, T-track nuts, a set screw, Allen wrench, and our safety gear. Now let's run through a dry assembly. Let's start the dry assembly by marrying the base unit and our T-track to make a sled. Now our base unit has a recess to receive a miter bar. We're using a T-track today for our miter bar, but we could also use our standard miter bars. Happens that this T-track fits the miter slot of our bandsaw perfectly, and we thought it would be interesting to use it. Now to complete our sled, we're going to also add a stop block and a handle. After our sled is assembled, I'm going to go ahead and attach our support beam and the two support components. And that should be it. I'll go ahead and fully assemble all these components and be back with the finished jig. Welcome back. After 10 minutes of assembly, the finished jig. Let's take a close look at what we have here. On the back side, we have the T-track mounted, we have our stop block, and we have our handle. On the top side, we have our support beam, and we have our two support components. Our support beam has been mounted at a perfect 90 degree to the sled. Housed inside of that unit is our pivot pin, which can slide and be adjusted at any distance from the edge of the support beam. We're almost there, but before we get to using the jig, let's discuss some prep work. I'll be cutting a 9-inch diameter circle for our demo. I started by cutting the stock material to 10 by 10 square, mark the center, and drill the pivot hole at the center of the square. Now, because I'm going to cut a 9-inch diameter circle, I've gone ahead and adjusted the pivot pin to exactly 4.5 inches from the edge of the support beam, which is also where the bandsaw blade is going to be. When our stock is mounted to the jig, it's fully supported and is able to freely rotate about the pivot pin. Now with the prep work out of the way, let's head over to the bandsaw and get started. Now over at the bandsaw, I've double checked to make sure that our support beam is exactly at 90 degrees to our sled, and that our pivot pin is exactly 4.5 inches from the cutting blade. And for a final check, I've made sure that our stop block at the bottom of the jig is set to stop the jig travel precisely when the pivot pin and the cutting edge of the blade align. And with all of that finally out of the way, we're ready to cut our circle. I've gone ahead and mounted our stock material onto the jig. I'm going to get the safety gear on, power the machines up, and cut the circle. So here's the circle we just cut. Turned out well, and the jig did a fine job. Now, what if we wanted to cut a circle without the center hole? That would be the case if we were making a cutting board, for example. For that, we need to do a little bit more prep work. So here we have the original circle that we cut with a hole in it. And here we have another 10 by 10 blank stock. We're going to glue these two pieces together with a secure bond. Now we could use double stick tape, or, as I'm going to do, use a glue gun. Let's get to it. Well, now that we have these pieces securely bonded together, we're ready to go. I'm going to place this joint workpiece back on the jig with a center hole on the pivot pin. Then we can go ahead and make the second cut just like we did the first cut. Back at the bench again with the second cut. I'm going to go ahead and separate these two pieces with a putty knife. And here we are with a second piece that has no hole in it. I think it turned out well again. As a close, I also want to demonstrate how to cut a ring with that jig that we made. To do that, I'm going to go back to the jig, move the pivot pin 1 inch closer to the blade, get this set up, and we'll start to cut. Back at the jig, I've already gone ahead and moved the pivot pin 1 inch closer to the blade, mounted our stock, and we're ready to cut. And here's the ring we just cut. It has an entry cut, but with a little bit of glue and clamping, that joint's going to disappear. And we'll have a ring that looks very much like this one. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thank you for watching. To see more of these Jig-Master series, come back and join us again at the workshop. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and God bless.